Over the past 3 years, diplomacy shut down, and as a result, only military solutions were considered in the Ukraine war. Without any diplomatic paths to peace, the Ukraine war became a war of attrition, in which victory is achieved by bleeding out and destroying the adversary. And the uncomfortable reality is that it was the West that shut down diplomacy, not the Russians. This is worth noting because the narratives are now beginning to be altered, which I will circle back to. Now, this meant that the Western political leadership stood by on the sideline as hundreds of thousands of young men died on the front lines, refusing to sit down to even speak with the Russians, to discuss possible solutions to end the war, to prevent escalation, and even mitigate some of the excesses of the war. So we also saw that this rejection of diplomacy, it was sold to the public as a moral choice. Indeed, a consensus was formed around the idea that this was the right thing to do and to speak with Russia was dangerous. The rhetoric was that diplomacy alone would be a reward to Putin. There was the need to delegitimize Russia, and even speaking to Russia would be a way of legitimizing it. Most importantly, the key strategy of the NATO countries was to isolate Russia in the international system, and maintaining diplomatic ties would undermine this key objective. Keep in mind, Russia would be defeated on the battlefield, the economic sanctions should crush its economy, and it should be isolated in the international sphere. So even having diplomacy with Russia was seen as being problematic. However, now that the war is coming to an end, as the war has been lost, diplomacy must eventually restart. So there's an awkwardness now. How do we explain this fact that we didn't do any diplomacy for all these years? So a new narrative has to be constructed, suggesting that the West never really ended diplomacy at all. It was the Russians who couldn't be worked with. Now, I had such an encounter on CGTN when the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs, Joel Rubin, argued that it was disinformation to claim that the West had abandoned diplomacy for these 3 years. I could not even present my argument as he refused to listen to what he labeled disinformation. Europeans, much like Zelensky, is pushing for a long war. Again, they've been very hostile to any diplomacy negotiations. There's a reason why the Europeans have refused to engage in any diplomacy to sit down with the Russians for 3 years. And even now, they express great concern when...
That's not true.
Okay. So anyways,
let's continue.
But the main concern... Yeah, thanks. I think it's quite
France
obvious.
has been engaging, and Germany have been engaging for the last 3 years.
Joe, let Glenn finish. Okay. Yeah.
So, anyways,
I know, but I'm not going to be on a show where disinformation is provided.
You have your turn, but let's Glenn have his turn. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's not an opinion. It's not an opinion. It's a factual situation.
Now, to be fair, Macron did initially try to reach out and speak with Putin and look if there were any ways of ending the war diplomatically. But this was immediately after Russia invaded. And it must be said that this was fiercely criticized by the other Europeans as being immoral, and he eventually had to fall into line. Macron, he questioned this opposition initially. He called this mistaken morality of not talking to the other side. And indeed, he was very much correct. The idea that it's moral not to speak to the other side is a very strange notion, given how much human suffering occurs in the absence of diplomacy. And at the time, Macron explained that if he did not speak to Russia, then diplomacy would be outsourced to non-European powers, such as Turkey or China, who would then be responsible for building peace in Europe. And as Europe now are not even invited to the negotiations, we can only conclude that Macron was indeed very correct. But why did the diplomacy not work, and why did he have to abandon it? Well, the Europeans put a lot of pressure on France to fall into line, because the policy or approach they were taking was the diplomatic isolation of Russia. That is, that diplomacy would not be a tool to pursue peace, it would be an instrument to coerce an adversary. Whereas Politico wrote, "What the hell is Macron thinking?" referring to his efforts to end the war with diplomacy. Now, to speak with the opponent during a conflict was presented as unacceptable. Diplomacy was considered to be reward for good behavior, and thus, when the conflict broke out, when really diplomacy was needed, the logic or the moral of the EU was that it was now no longer moral to speak with Russia. To speak with the opponent during a conflict was presented as unacceptable. Diplomacy was argued to be reward for good behavior. Thus, when there was bad behavior, diplomacy should be cut. Of course, the opposite should be true. When conflicts break out, this is really when diplomacy is necessary. And yet, this is when one is argued that, well, it's argued that this should be abandoned instead. So at the end of the day, nothing could be achieved with Macron's diplomacy either, when Macron even argued that Russia might need some security guarantees relating to NATO's eastward expansion in order to pull back its troops and accept a ceasefire. It was outright rejected. Even discussing Russian security was also seen as immoral, given that this was allegedly an unprovoked attack. And furthermore, it would merely reward the aggressor. So only defeat would be acceptable. Now, the decision was therefore made to isolate Russia. And to this end, as I said, diplomacy became a weapon. We saw the US and the EU cut off high-level communication. The foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, he argued that the war would be solved on the battlefield. Then he was later changed. We had a new foreign policy chief of the EU, Kaja Kallas, who argued that she didn't believe in diplomacy with the Russians. Why would she talk to Putin? In her words, Putin is a war criminal, and she doesn't see the need to speak to war criminals.
To me, it's the question, why talk to him? I mean, why? He's a war criminal. I mean, I'm a lawyer by profession, and I looked up the definition of war crimes and genocide, for that matter. And it is the willingness to get rid of, part of the nation or a whole nation. And he has expressed this will, his intention. He has done steps for this, and he's a war criminal. And if you say that there is no outcome of talking to him, then why talk to him? Because I don't see into his head, of course, and into Kremlin's walls, but I feel that if everybody is constantly calling him, he doesn't get the message that he's isolated. So if we want to get him the message through that actually you're isolated, don't call him. It's no point.
Then with the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, who argued that war is the path to peace.
If we want a negotiated peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine, we need to provide military support to Ukraine. That's the only way. Weapons, they are the way to peace.
That is, the war would just end if Russia leaves. However, this would entail that the only path to peace would be if Russia capitulates, which is very unlikely, given that Russia considers this war to be an existential threat. And furthermore, when the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg argues that after the war, Ukraine will become a member of NATO, then they effectively make it very much impossible for Russia to leave. Now, this is cutting off all possible solutions, and yet this is also framed as moral. We also see that when the Russians would encounter the Western states in international institutions, the Western representatives would do a walkout or turn their backs and, well, simply behave as 18-year-old girls in the schoolyard, trying to freeze the Russians out. Now, in November of 2022, after Ukraine had a successful counteroffensive, US General Mark Milley argued that Ukraine was now in the best possible position to negotiate an end to the war. It was assumed, therefore, that thereafter the Russian would strengthen themselves. And if the point of supplying weapons was to make the Ukrainians in a good position to negotiate, well, it wouldn't get much better than this. However, Biden, or at least the Biden administration, quickly intervened and pushed back or walked back the statement of General Milley, and General Milley himself had to walk much of this back as well, because there would be no diplomacy, there would be no negotiations, and the war would have to continue. We also had peace proposals by China and Brazil. Blinken countered it, said that the US was not ready for a ceasefire. We saw peace summits emerge as well. They were held from Denmark to Switzerland. But again, in these peace summits, peace wasn't really discussed. The summits were openly used to mobilize support for Ukraine against Russia. The Ukrainian delegation openly said the purpose was to isolate Russia. Russia was not even invited to the peace summit, and the Russian security wasn't even discussed. In Switzerland, Poland's President Duda called for breaking up Russia into 200 smaller states. Again, a very strange peace summit indeed.
Russia is often called the prison of nations, and for good reason, because it is home to almost 200 ethnic groups, most of which became residents of Russia as a result of the methods used in Ukraine today. Russia remains the largest colonial empire in a world which, unlike European powers, has never undergone the process of decolonization and has never been able to deal with the demons of its past. As members of the international community, we have to finally say there is no more space for colonialism in the modern world.
And on a different occasion, the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, also envisioned this to be the end of the war by breaking Russia up into smaller states.
Russia's defeat is not a bad thing, because then, there could be really a change in the society, and there are many different nations right now part of Russia as well. I think if you would have more like small nations, it's not a bad thing if the big power is actually much smaller. So.
After Trump's election victory, Olaf Scholz decided to call Putin to make sure that Europe wasn't left behind. At this point, Zelensky warned that this could open Pandora's box. That is, that the risk was that it could open up for others also engaging in diplomacy. Suddenly, other actors could begin to speak to Russia as well, and this would undermine the entire effort of isolating Russia diplomatically. The Europeans also expressed their disappointment in Germany's desire to break with the diplomatic boycott. And while our friend Rubin from the former clip believes that diplomatic isolation of Russia is merely disinformation, the media reported widely on this, as Scholz effectively was seen to undermine this isolation. And the narrative was that Zelensky should decide when negotiations begin. And Zelensky himself had self-imposed restrictions by law that it was illegal to speak with Russia. And this, of course, is also a very strange narrative to embrace, because why should the EU not permit itself to have any talks with Russia without Ukraine in the room? Indeed, the Ukraine war was to a large extent the result of a collapsing European security architecture. The Europeans are engaged in a proxy war against the world's largest nuclear power. There are a lot of things which should be discussed at this time during such a conflict, And the idea that the European leaders shouldn't be allowed to speak to Ukraine without Zelensky's permission, to sell this to the public as some kind of a moral gesture is very, very absurd when they're playing with the lives of millions of their own citizens. And it's worth noting what diplomacy actually used to be. That is, it used to be an indispensable tool to mitigate the security competition between adversaries, to ensure that one side wouldn't expand its security at the expense of others. It was a way to reduce tensions and to resolve conflicts. The main idea would be to enhance mutual understanding, to pursue compromise, and enhance indivisible security. Yet, after the Cold War, we saw that the collective West pursued a different form of strategy, outlined by the US as global primacy. That is, the West would pursue collective hegemony. Now, in such a system where security derives from being dominant, diplomacy is no longer required by pursuing indivisible security. Indeed, the whole point is to enhance one's security at the expense of the other. So rather, it was for now, that is, the diplomacy was now an instrument to socialize other states. This was also something that was widely discussed, especially in academic literature. What is the role of the EU and NATO? Well, we were told they're socializing agents. Their job is to socialize other countries towards their norms and their values. And if you divide the world into liberal democracies versus the rest, and liberal democracy is what creates peace, suddenly it doesn't make any sense anymore to have mutual understanding and compromise. Indeed, why would good values compromise with bad values? Instead, the West conceptualized itself as the teacher, Russia and others were the students, and they could. And the point of diplomacy was to, teach them. And diplomacy also therefore took on a very pedagogic language. That is, the EU and NATO should reward the other countries for good behavior. Meanwhile, they should punish bad behavior. So what's diplomacy used for now? Well, if other countries behave well, such as Russia, then we'll allow them to sit at the table and discuss. When they behave bad, the institutions and diplomacy itself become an instrument to punish. And the result was, well, we already saw this in the Georgian War of 2008. That is, the NATO and Russia had built up a common institution, that is the NATO-Russia Council, to have diplomacy to resolve differences. However, as soon as a conflict emerged in Georgia, NATO responded by shutting down the dialogue within the NATO-Russia Council. So again, diplomacy was a reward, and this, given what was considered to be not a conflict because of security competition, but Russia's bad behavior, diplomacy itself was removed as a form of punishment in terms of isolating. Now, we see now that the unipolar world order definitely undermined the role of diplomacy. And as we now see that the world has already become multipolar, there's a new and very desperate need for the Europeans and the United States to relearn how to do diplomacy. Now, the Americans have already taken this step and pushing to end the war and challenging the whole notion that somehow talking to your opponent is something bad and evil to be condemned. Yet the Europeans are still not there, and they still have a far way to go.